Summer, like every summer in Greece, was of course long and hot. And Theseus, brave and bold and young and daring, was making the land journey from the home of his mother to Athens, bearing with him the sword and shield of his late father that he'd just come into possession of and was going to deliver to King Aegeus and claim his inheritance. Now, he could have gone by the sea route, jumped in the ship and been there before he knew it safe and sure. But as his mother had outlined the fact that the land route was not only longer but far, far more dangerous, with many gateways to death and the underworld en route, he, being willing to prove his manhood and his bravery and his courage and his daring and his ingenuity, had, of course, decided to go by that very route. And on the journey from his motherland to Athens, he had already encountered 3 terrible challenges, any one of which could have sent him down into the depths of Hades, down into the land of the dead. He had met with Periphetes, the bandit, the robber, who wielded an enormous club and had battered to death who knows how many travellers and robbed them blind. And after a long struggle and a battle, wrestling with Periphetes, he had snatched the club off him and battered the man to death with his own club. And then he'd encountered Sinis, another terrible brigand, who had killed who knows how many people, not, in his case, with a club, but through his own favourite and particularly unpleasant method of bending 2 enormous pine trees together and tying them down until they were so tense, and then tying his unfortunate victims by their arms and legs to the cross formed by the pine trees, and then snapping the rope so they flew apart, ripping out their arms and legs and leaving the stumping, bleeding mess of their torso to hit the earth and leach their vital juices into the Greek soil. And just as Theseus had dealt with a club-wielding bandit by subjecting him to his own brutal way of dealing with other people, so Sinis ended up tied to his own pine trees and split into 5 rather awful parts. For Theseus had a taste, an appetite for poetic justice. And when he encountered his 3rd challenge, the gargantuan pig that dwelt near Crommyon, raised by a cackling old hag called Fea, and many people ended up calling the pig itself Fea. It had been rooting up and eating and devouring everything in sight across the countryside around Crommyon, consuming crops and leaving people to die of starvation, devouring wild beasts in the forest, raiding into farmers' lands and eating their livestock, eating the farmers themselves, eating anyone it came across. Well, he delivered poetic justice. After a long and hard battle, he slaughtered the great fat sow herself and then cooked her and ate her as a bacon butty. And it had kept him going for quite a long journey. Until eventually he came to the coastal path that curved itself around by Corinth, that had been carved hundreds of years earlier out of the very mountains. So mountains to one side, a little narrow path, and then a long, long drop into the ocean itself. And rumours had reached his ears that there was another bandit who had settled along this narrow pathway, a man who was a descendant of Poseidon, maybe a son, maybe a grandson. Different people said different things as to exactly quite how this urchin, this Sciron, was related to Poseidon. But whilst most of the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of the gods become great, noble, brave creatures, not all of them do. Some people fall a long way short of their divine heritage. And indeed, some might say that is true of the entire human race, that we all have a little spark of the divine in us, but Most of us do very little to fan that spark into glowing embers. Rather, we smother the spark with wicked deeds and greed and dishonesty and barbarity and perversion and cruelty. And it has to be said that Sciron was one such. And so Theseus was not wholly unprepared when, looking a couple of 100 yards ahead on the coastal path, he saw a sort of an alcove carved into the mountainside. And in that alcove, part of the mountain had been shaped roughly like a throne, a seat. And sitting in that seat, sunning himself in the glorious Greek heat, was a very tall man. And as Theseus got closer, he could see that this man was no longer in the first flush of youth. He'd clearly been quite a big man, quite a hefty man, a very well-built warrior in his youth, but now he was old and grey, and some of his muscles were turning to flab, but he was still a sizable man, not someone to be taken lightly. And around this throne, if we can call it that, this seat carved into the mountainside, there were sacks and chests, the kind of thing that travellers going on long journeys would often stuff all their worldly possessions into, because in that day and age, if you were going out on a long journey, you had absolutely no guarantee you would arrive there in one piece, let alone come back again in one piece, and so people would often take their important possessions with them. And as he got closer and closer to this throne in the rock, the old man sitting in the throne, Sciron, raised a hand and hailed him and beckoned him forward, and said to him, I see you are a traveller, weighed down by your baggage. Will you not rest a while here with me and help to pass the time of a lonely old man? And Theseus, not being one to be rude or to insult the elderly, placed down his baggage. Now, he wasn't as encumbered as most travellers are, but he had his sword and his shield, or at least the sword and the shield had belonged to his father, and money with him, and food and such like. So he placed his baggage next to the baggage of however many other travellers had been past this throne of Sciron. And the old man said, It is the custom in our part of the world for the young to show their admiration and dedication to their elders by washing their feet. And Theseus looked down at the feet of Sciron, which were sandalled, but clearly in need of a lot of attention. The toenails were very overgrown, and there were calluses and lumps and bumps and great mounds of hard skin, and judging from the whiff, it had been quite some time since Sciron's feet had been properly washed. And the old man pointed to a big wooden bowl that was near the base of his seat, and said, Will you not take up some water and wash an old man's feet, and show your civility to the elderly? Come, I am just a harmless old man. You have nothing to fear from me. And again Theseus, not wanting to be rude or insulting, took the great bowl and placed it at the feet of the old man, who kicked off his sandals and placed his pungent feet in the bowl of water. There is a sponge there, you can use it to wash my feet, he said. And Theseus knelt down and took up the sponge and began to wash the old man's feet. Let me lift up my feet a little, that you might wash the sole. And so he lifted up his left foot, and Theseus cradled it and began washing the sole of the foot. But the rumours he had heard in the days earlier had prepared him to steel himself and not to be taken by surprise. So when old Sciron shoved his foot with great force at Theseus, whilst many an unprepared traveller would have undoubtedly fallen backwards over the cliff, down into the ocean, Theseus was braced and caught the foot before it could send him flying over the edge. And the old man roared and struggled to get his foot back, and with his other foot shoved that hard against Theseus too. But again the warrior was prepared, and he grabbed the man's other foot, and they struggled and heaved together until Theseus, pulling backwards, dragged the old man out of his throne, and he fell arse first into the bowl of water, roaring and shouting and flailing his fists and reaching for the dagger in his belt. But Theseus would allow him no advantage, no time in which to arm himself. Grabbing the old man's ankles and calves to himself, he hauled and swung round, and Sciron went down, down, down the cliff face into the ocean below, where Poseidon, his ancestor, father, grandfather, who knows, was bubbling away and up from the ocean bed, eager for another meal. Having received so many meals in the past from Sciron, came a creature that we may think of as some distant relation of Sciron's, for it was a creature of the oceans, just as ultimately Sciron himself was a creature of the oceans. It came bubbling to the surface, this huge mound of a thing with a great snapping head, like a turtle with a great beak upon it, and writhing tentacles and flailing arms and limbs, grabbing and snatching at the old man and dragging him screaming and gurgling down into the depths, and the waters boiled red. And Sciron was no more, and the beast of the oceans had received its last free meal from him. And what became of that beast, well, who can say? It may be swimming the oceans around Corinth still, for all I know. But up upon the mountain path, Theseus stood up, brushed himself off, picked up his father's sword and shield and his food and other things that he was carrying up in his backpack, and had a swift look at all of the other treasures piled up beside the old man's throne that belonged to people that were no doubt just bones at the bottom of the ocean now, and decided he would leave them where they stood. And he went upon his journey, and when he reached the city of Isthmus, he heard that they had a small festival once a year, and he said to them, "There is a great fortune piled up upon the mountain path. I wish you to collect it and take that money and invest it in a great festival, a great sporting contest that will be held once a year, the Isthmian Games. These will be dedicated to Poseidon, for it had occurred to Theseus on his journey down the path from that throne that, wicked though Sciron was, he was ultimately still related to a god, and that god might take offence if something were not done to compensate him for the loss of an indigent relative. And so the Isthmian Games were set up and were celebrated from that day to this very day. They are still celebrated in Greece and Greek diasporas around the world in honour of the god of the ocean and his many strange and peculiar children, both those who dwell at the depths of the ocean and those that make it up onto shore. And Theseus, having done this, continued on his long journey to face more great challenges. But they are stories for another time, and this is the end of this part of the story.